Dear Professor Andy Knight, I'm so happy that you were able to join me today. Since before starting this series of interviews, I had two names at the top of my list, and you were one of them. I first came to know about your work through two university friends. They were passionate readers of global governance in the early 2000s. They also took great pride in the fact that a Baha'i had become editor of such a highly respected journal. It was, of course, the theme of global governance itself that drew their attention, and more broadly, the attention of Baha'i students of politics. If I remember correctly, your PhD focused on reform of the United Nations system, and this was sometime between the late 1980s and the mid-90s, 1990s. This means you had chosen to focus on global governance even before the Cold War ended or before the fall of the Soviet Union. In academic terms, that strikes me as something of a risky choice at the time, one not many would have taken. It also means that you have been working on this topic of global governance from the moment it began to emerge with force in the early 1990s. Right. Later, I learned from another colleague that your intellectual interests were highly integrative, that you were seeking to develop a form of knowledge about global politics that is genuinely global in character across continents, regions, and nations. Mm-hmm. This integrative outlook is clearly reflected in the wide range of themes you have worked on. These include hegemony, democracy and good governance, global disorder, the UN system, conflict resolution and peace building, global civil society, global health governance and security, children and armed conflict, piracy in the Horn of Africa, the vulnerabilities and resilience of small island developing states in the Caribbean, as well as statelessness, the responsibility to protect, extremism, counterterrorism, female suicide terrorism, human security, human rights, and human dignity. And most recently, I think, your work has focused on systemic barriers faced by Black children and youth across Canada.
Correct.
That is a very impressive array of topics and themes. Later in my own studies, I came across your global politics textbook with Tom Keating, which I found to be a wonderful introduction, and I have been recommending it to Baha'is, well, as much as I could. I've also encountered one of your chapters in a volume edited by Jim Whitman, where your work appears alongside several chapters by James Rosenau, which, as many would know, was one of the founders of the concept of global governance. Right. And of course, I am now most attracted to a book that was very famous and is still very foundational, A Changing United Nations, Multilateral Evolution and the Quest for Global Governance. I think of you as one of the most serious thinkers the Baha'i community has on the question of world order, and as a pioneer in the broader field of global governance. Given that you were already deeply engaged with these questions in the early 90s, and that you have continued this work until now, you are in a unique position to assess the present moment. So perhaps we could begin there. Yeah. How, what are your thoughts? How do you make sense of the current moment, the moment we are in 2026?
That's a good place to start, because almost everything that I've done up to this point in my career have been focused on trying to understand what's going on in the current period with a look at what's gone on in the past. So I believe very much in the notion of academics being historians in some ways. The history of how we got to where we are is very important. And many times we see a lot of things that happen, we think this is new, this is something that's very new. And then when you think about it and you research what has happened in the past, you realize it has happened before. So there's a lot of repetition of what's gone on before. And some people might say history kind of repeats itself, but I don't think it repeats itself in a circle. It's more like a spiral because we learn lessons. Hopefully, we learn lessons, not all the time, but we learn lessons most of the time from what's gone on in the past. And as a result, we are able to either improve upon, you know, our future, our present, our future, by learning lessons from the past. Now, when we don't learn lessons from the past, we spiral downwards. So I think you can look at this as a possibility of spiraling up or spiraling down. And I think we are right now at a moment in history where we're spiraling downwards, unfortunately, because we haven't really understood and learned our lessons from the past. So basically, I know you want to talk about the interregnum because I've been talking most recently in my work about the concept of the interregnum, and it comes from, in large part, from one of my professors, Robert Cox, who's now passed away, but who had a kind of a Bredelian view of the world. This notion that you can look at the world in terms of its longue durée as opposed to current events history. So sometimes you get caught up in the current events. Right now, we're caught up in the current events history of the United States attacks on Iran, the United States attacks on Venezuela, the Russian attacks on Ukraine. And we get so caught up in these, what I call current events, historical moments, that we forget the panoramic view of history. You know, you have to look at history in terms of panoramic view, the ups and downs, you know, the mountains and the valleys of human experience. So I try to let my students know that that what they're witnessing right now, which is very troublesome for them, a time of flux and uncertainty, a time of disequilibrium, a time of discontinuity, that this is really a pattern that we've seen before in other interregna. Now, interregnums are usually that period of time between two world orders. So they have the world order of the past, 1945 world order, which created the United Nations system, which created the Bretton Woods institutions, which created a whole bunch of norms and rules and regulations in an attempt to try to stop World War III from happening, right? Because this was during the World War II period. And those lessons that we learned from that period of time, those norms, those rules, those regulations are now under attack by the current regime in the United States, primarily Donald Trump, but he's not the only one. But it seems as though those norms and those rules that created the world order of 1945 are now being decimated. I say that the pillars which held up the world order of 1945, those pillars are being undermined. They're crumbling right before our eyes. We can see this, and that's why my work sort of touches on a whole bunch of stuff like, you know, democracy, for example. I talk about failing democracies. I talk about democracies that are backsliding. Um, I talk about the, the wars and the rumors of wars, the number of attempts to try to use force rather than use peaceful mediation and measures to stop wars from occurring. And everything seems to be happening all at the same time. So I try to put things in perspective for my students by saying this period of discontinuity really is a reflection of the interregnum, this period of this period of flux and uncertainty, which indicates that the world order of 1945 is coming to an end, and that there is a new world order that hasn't yet quite emerged. And if you go back to when this term was first used by individuals like Antonio Gramsci, he had the modern conception of Interregnum. I think he can be sort of credited with that. He said that the old order is dying and a new order cannot yet be born. So in this interregnum, a great variety of morbid symptoms appear, and we can see those morbid symptoms appearing right now in this interregnum. So this is really a formulation, kind of analytical way of understanding what's happening right now. So I don't know if you want me to stop there because I said a lot already, but I think this just to confirm, some of the key characteristics of the interregnum include the fact that there is a crisis in legitimacy. So existing institutions, existing norms, existing authorities are losing credibility as we speak. People are no longer willing to believe in the old order. We had our Prime Minister of Canada just recently spoke at Davos. He talked about the fact that there was a rupture, and that's the term he used. And I kind of agree with him to some extent. There's a rupture in the old world order, the rules of the game of the old world order, the rules of trade, for example, is being ruptured by Donald Trump's imposition of tariffs, which goes against everything that we thought about when it comes to free trade. And we can no longer trust that our leaders are going to be adhering to any laws on any rules. So the president of the United States, which is the president of one of the largest countries in the world, and by the way, the United States was the architect or one of the architects of the world order that was created in 1945. We know this because we know that the United States was very, very actively involved in the creation of the United Nations Charter. It worked with both Britain and Russia and Soviet Union at the time to create this new institution of governance. It was given a veto authority to make sure that it's worked within the United Nations system rather than working from outside of the organization. So all these things really were put in place largely by the United States in collaboration with Britain, which was the hegemonic power that was declining. The United States was being the hegemonic power that was on the ascent. And it looked like the world was going to be a much more peaceful world. And I would say it was a precarious peace because of the presence of nuclear weapons. And so once you have nuclear weapons, then your peace is kind of imposed upon you because you don't want to utilize nuclear weapons that would be destroying the world. But there were also civil conflicts in many different parts of the world. There were many countries that wanted to be part of the international policy making, but weren't present in 1945. Think about this, there were only 51 states that were present when the United Nations system was created. So there would have been 100 some odd states that were not yet independent states or were not considered to be sovereign and distinct states as yet. So when those new states came into the system, obviously the United Nations system had to change, it had to expand its membership. And by expanding its membership, it had to also embrace a whole bunch of new things that needed to be done to help those countries develop, to perhaps try to solve some of the crises of legitimacy for those countries and so on. So a key characteristic of the interregnum is the crisis in the legitimacy, the norms and the authority that have lost their credibility. And I might add that as well, we have seen what I call institutional drift or a breakdown in the global governance structures, so that the global governance structures that we have come to know since 1945 have become a lot less effective, a lot less coherent, a lot less efficient. So hence there are lots of arguments about, and this probably reflects some of the stuff I've written about back in the 1990s, when I talked about the need for United Nations reform. You mentioned the book that I wrote on a changing United Nations, and then I did an edited volume on adapting the United Nations to a postmodern era. And that was simply an indication that the institutions of governance were starting to try to adapt to changing pressures or pressures for change. And therefore, the global governance structures, in some cases, were less effective than they normally would have been. In some cases, were less coherent. In many cases, definitely not efficient enough. So we've seen a kind of institutional drift occurring during the interregnum. And the final thing I would like to say is that what we're witnessing right now is what is akin to normative uncertainty, which means that there are so many different competing visions of what should replace the old world order, because it's definitely dying. But there's no clear consensus yet as to the future direction of the new world order. Um, this is something that is in the making. So I try to encourage my students by saying, while there's a lot of drift and a lot of problems with the current state of affairs, they should be heartened by the fact that we as individual human beings, we all have agency and we all can contribute in some way to the creation of whatever the new world order would be like. So which means, yes, there will be heightened contestation, there will be heightened political, ideological, and social struggles in this moment of uncertainty, in this interregnum. There will be competing actors attempting to shape the new world order. Some are moving up the ladder, some are moving down the ladder. I think the United States is definitely moving down the ladder at this particular moment in time. This loss is its legitimacy as a hegemonic power. So hegemonic power is no longer can be assigned to the United States, as far as I'm concerned. And then there's the rise of China, the rise of India, the rise of South Africa, the rise of the BRICS. There are a rise of number of new governance systems to replace the old governance systems, but we are not quite there yet. So to go back to Gramsci, I think his term for destabilizing phenomena, which is the interregnum, um, arises because of this vacuum that we find ourselves in, the vacuum of the absence of proper global governance. And we can see the evidence of this, empirical evidence of this is the extremism that we are trying to address now, the whole populism thing that's changing the way we look at what democracy ought to be, and the institutional paralysis of the United Nations, as the United States, one of the founders of the United Nations, is starting to pull out of UN agencies, UN bodies. I think over 30, 40 UN agencies the United States have pulled out of. And it's trying to starve the institution by refusing to pay up its assessed contributions, reducing its contributions to, say, aid. USAID no longer exists as a funding body from the United States. And then there's the whole issue of the violence and the fragmentation that the world is witnessing. And I remember you talked about James Rosnow, right? James Rosnow, I had him here at the University of Alberta in Canada before he passed away. And he was talking about what they call fragmegration. That's a term I started to use back in the 1990s, I think, late 1990s, when James Rosnow had already coined that term. But basically, that there were two forces colliding. One is one of fragmentation, and the other was one of integration. So he talks about the fragmentation and in terms of um, uh, something that would compete with integration. So those two things to be intersecting at the same time. So I think I will leave it there because I think I've given you a lot to chew on right now. But basically, I'm saying that this moment that we're living in right now, it seems to be one of what Gramsci called an interregnum, and that we are not quite there yet when it comes to the new world order that should be created.
You are helping me put forward my questions very well. Um, Going back to definitions regarding interregnum, because what I want to emphasize is that I think you have a different view on this notion than many others. And so I'll just kind of rehearse some of the previous views that people might know about. So, as you mentioned, the notion originates with Gramsci, who uses it to describe crisis of hegemony when ruling classes lose consent and no alternative order has yet consolidated power. You've clearly expressed that and taken that on. Other authors like Nancy Fraser have used Interregnum to analyze the breakdown of neoliberal hegemony, arguing that we are in a hegemonic gap between progressive neoliberalism and an emergent post-neoliberal order. That would have been some years ago, I guess. Then there are those like Arjun Appadurai, who have employed the term to describe a world of rising nationalism and declining liberal consensus. I would describe the present moment as marked by the demise of liberal democracy, the weakening of the international liberal order and international law, which is included, and the rise of ethno-nationalism and white supremacy. Adam Tooze, on the other hand, to invoke somebody more recent, has argued we are living in a Gramscian interregnum at the global level, and that the polycrisis is the form that this disorder takes in practice. The Tooze interregnum describes a condition in which the US-led liberal international order, established after 1945 and intensified after 1991, marked by globalization, deep financial integration, and institutions such as the IMF, WTO, and coordinated central banking, continues to structure global affairs but has come under huge pressure. This old order is fraying, yet no stable replacement for US hegemony has emerged. As rising powers, especially China, lack a fully articulated alternative system, and geopolitical blocs remain fragmented, resulting not in outright collapse, but in persistent, unresolved instability. Now, when I think of your notion of interregnum, I find it differs in terms of what the interregnum is between. So, what are the two periods that the interregnum is between? Because at least in what you have written in the past, your interregnum seems to mark a period of transition from an oversimplified state-centric vision of world order towards a more nuanced, sophisticated, and encompassing notion of global governance. And this is a complex thing because this sounds very much to me like an interregnum leading to a global order or world order based largely on global governance institutions and a variety of global governance actors, from states to NGOs to civil society to transnational corporations to a plethora of agencies, from business associations and public-private consortia, bond rating agencies, transnational social movements, transnational advocacy networks, and so on, to epistemic communities, coalitions of NGOs, security communities, and so forth. So I think there's two things that happen here for me. And if I had time, I would quote you from one of your chapters in which you say that in the absence of world government, the patchwork concoction that we call global governance may in fact be our best hope for bringing stability, equity, justice, and sustainability to our present new world disorder. What I take from this is that you are not, so it sounds to me like you might be arguing not only for the reform of international governmental organizations like the United Nations, but for a whole new way to look at global governance as a place where a sort of new tissue of institutions is emerging. And this doesn't look in the simple way in which someone who has an interest in global institutions would look at this picture thinking, they would think about 3 or 4 major global institutions and think that we should just empower those or support them or whatever. Your view is very, very different, and it's a very critical view because you are critical of these institutions. You remark that they are biased, that they advantage the wealthy nations, the developed nations, that they undermine the participation of the global south and nations from the global south in decision makings, that the rules, when they are implemented, they are again distorted by the power interests of the bigger nations. And so uh, there is clearly a very critical tone about these institutions, which you and entire sphere of global governance, which you seek to kind of reform. And that was in the good old days that critique applied. when and now things are a lot more dire than at that point. And so a question that I have, there's two questions here. The first question is, could you describe more this patchwork concoction that is really, in a sense, is what differentiates you from some of the other names I've mentioned? What is this global governance scene that you were seeing, at least in the past, if not necessarily in the present? And then the second question is, how does this all relate to real power, and especially to the fact that the world order we had was not, in my view, I mean, this is a debate. Was the world order we had a sort of liberal international order and multinational centric kind of order? Or to what extent was it that? And to what extent was it a US-led world order where benefits accrue to the West, in particular, Europe included, maybe, and so forth? So, because as now the realist perspective comes back with great power for everyone, there is a tendency to suggest that all of that liberal international order was just a sort of appendix or a sort of extra feature of the real structure of power, which was a US empire, which had military bases from the end of Europe to the end of Asia, controlling trade, controlling sea routes, controlling choke points, satellites in the air, drones, war, invasions, covert ops, and all sorts of ways in which to make sure you were the world hegemon in the power sense, but then also that there was this dimension. There is a sort of continuum between this power dimension and the soft power dimension. So there's two questions there. One is, what is that global thing that is emerging, that is possibly taking us to something very different than just going from a world order with one hegemon to another world order with another hegemon? What is that? And then how do we look at the US now? Because I think, and many would have said this, and I think you've said it today, with things like the Venezuela episode, special military operation in January, and the talk about Greenland and other things that we are witnessing, I think most analysts would say that the United States has committed a sort of hegemonic suicide, which means they have reverted to a sort of old colonial imperial power that just seeks to assert itself through force by controlling supply chains, using economic statecraft, and moving to a whole series of moves that feature within a realpolitik type of scenario. And there's a lot of debate between those that think there is a 5D, how do you call it? 5 dimensions chess game taking place, and those who think there's absolute chaos and there's nothing really thoughtful about it. But yeah, to return to the two questions. So the first question is, what is that global thing that was emerging that could replace this constant competition for imperial hegemony, and or attenuated maybe? And how do you see the US now? And because I think the two are connected, because the liberal order has a lot to do with the United States. the reason
Right.
it is fraying, it is because of the United States. Thank you. Sorry.
No, that's a good way to look at this because you're right. You're absolutely right. I mean, there was a time when I came out of my PhD and I'd written a dissertation on the United Nations reform, and I tried my best to see how we could change the United Nations system in a way that would make it much more relevant to the current period. And of course, that was just around the time of the end of the Cold War. Now, this is very important because what we're talking here is about structural changes, not just reforms in the sense of tweaking things and oiling the machine. You have a squeaky door and you want to make sure the door doesn't squeak anymore. You put some oil in the hinges and that sort of stops the squeaking, but the door is still there. And it could actually go back to squeaking again if you don't have enough oil to make sure that it doesn't squeak. So what I'd like to do is to put it in the context of, again, my mentor Robert Cox, when he taught me at York University, he used to talk about, and that is you have to first of all understand how world orders are created. Now, world orders are created in most cases by a hegemonic power, a power that has military might, economic might, both hard power and soft power elements, but a hegemonic power. And if you understand that, then you understand that hegemony uh, has led to the notion of a hegemonic state. So the United States was the hegemon, replacing Britain, which was the hegemon before the United States was hegemon. And Britain replaced the Netherlands, which was a hegemon before the UK became a hegemon. So
And there was also the Iberian system
yes,
before that.
yes.
So there's like 500 years of.
Exactly, between the different periods. Now, the important thing here is that all world orders have at least three major pillars. The first is material capability, which means the economic and military power that supports the world order. The second is a series of institutions like the International Monetary Fund, the World Bank, the World Trade Organizations, etc., which is geared is actually supported again by the material capabilities, right? But these are the ones that help to govern the world. And then ideas, which is very important. The ideas are the norms and the values and the shared understandings that are put in place and actually utilized by the institutions. Many of those material capabilities actually support certain types of ideas. So there's always going to be contestation of ideas, as there will be contestation of institutions, as there are, again, material capabilities that rise and fall. So what you see happening when a hegemon declines, when a hegemonic order declines, is that there is an attack on these three pillars: material capabilities, institutions, and ideas. So there's, in most cases, as we are seeing right now in what I call the interregnum period, we see the breakdown of coherence. Institutions no longer reflecting the material realities of the world. I mean, how many times have we said that the UN Security Council is useless because there's a veto system in place that that causes the organization not to function in the way the UN Charter expected it to function. So there are lots of conflicts across the globe that are not being resolved because the institutions no longer reflect the material realities of the world. Um, the material realities should change the institutions when those material realities change. So, for example, when you have the rise of India, the rise of Pakistan, two now nuclear powers, why do they have? Why do they not have a place within the Security Council, for example, that's either permanent or semi-permanent? So the institution really has not reflected material changes that have happened in the world. The UK is no longer a big power, but yet still it holds that prominent place within the Security Council. Russia replaced the USSR without any sort of vote within the UN Security Council or within the United Nations General Assembly. Um, uh, China replaced, mainland China replaced Taiwan on the Security Council. So there have been changes, but the institution hasn't really reflected in reality the material, the realities of the globe in a way. So we have ideas also that lose legitimacy. Faith in the liberal, you talk about the liberal institution, it's national order. But that was a really a liberal ideology that was foisted upon the UN system by the United States. The charter, which was written in large part in collaboration between the UK and the United States, and in some cases Russia, the charter really has those ideals that are present in any sort of liberal globalization ideology. But don't forget that liberal internationalism was something that benefited the hegemonic power, because the hegemonic power usually has control over the ideas that would govern the global governance institutions, right? From then on. So from 1945 until I would say around 1989, 1990, I will explain why that particular turning point. But you have a structure of world order that's largely bipolar, right? The United States and the Soviet Union clashing with each other, trying to sort of gain supremacy over each other. But certainly there was that kind of bipolar structure. The world was literally divided into spheres of influence. Spheres of influence for the United States, spheres of influence for Russia or the Soviet Union. So that bipolar system lasted really until about 1989, 1990. The Soviet Union fell apart, right, in 1990, and broke up into 15 different states. It was no longer the Soviet Union. So that's one of the structural material capabilities that meant missing after 1989. The United States then became the sole hegemonic power rather than competing with the Soviet Union for hegemony. It became the sole hegemonic power. So we talked a lot about the unilateral United States, right? The unipolarity became a thing as opposed to bipolarity. So the structure of the international system was much more unipolar because this giant of a country had much more weight and much more say in everything that went on around the globe. In fact, some people talked about the United States as a global policeman. And that was not that far-fetched because it was involved in every sort of skirmish around the globe. It had military personnel all over the globe, and it still does today. But at some point in time, what happened to the Soviet Union may happen to the United States as well, because the Soviet Union overextended itself. If you get a chance to read Paul Kennedy's book about the rise and the fall of the great powers, you'll see what I mean. Great powers tend to overextend themselves and usually have built in within them their own demise, right? So Soviet Union demise, yes. Russia took over, but it's not nearly as powerful as the Soviet Union was. The United States now is on that period of decline because it's no longer consider itself to be the unipolar power, right? Why? Because China has risen, India, Pakistan, South Africa, Brazil, the BRICS, these are rising countries. So this means that the material capability pillar of the old world order is changing as well. And then, of course, the ideas. You know, the United States wanted to control through soft power the rest of the world. It wasn't intended to use military might for everything. It would also use its own internal what should we call it? Its internal norms and the ways it looked at itself as a way to entice other people to join the United States. So that means they're not hitting them over the head with a big stick all the time, but sometimes using an incentive to get them to come over to the other side. So we saw a lot of this happening when the Soviet Union fell apart. Some of the countries that used to be part of that Warsaw Pact, right? Some of those countries went over to the Western countries, to the Western side in some ways. A number of countries that were authoritarian and non-democratic became democratic. So we had this rise in the number of democratic states. And it turned out to be a temporary rise because some of those same states now have backslid when it comes to democracy and now are considered to be illiberal democracies. So the ideas itself, that pillar of ideas that helps to shore up the world order, those ideas are coming under attack. So the liberal institutional world order, which really revolved around liberal ideas, things like democracy, human rights, and all those things are now under strain because even the United States, which supported those ideas and actually introduced those ideas to the United Nations, even the United States now is now pushing back on those ideas. I don't think you can consider the United States to be as democratic as a lot of people felt it was. And it tries to foist its version of democracy on other states. That's a problem because not everybody wants to be a democracy like the United States. In fact, I would say that if you use the United States as the model of democracy, we would be in serious problems because look and see what has happened to the United States internally right now with their democracy. They're so divided between Republicans and Democrats. There have a few people in between, in the middle, but generally speaking, they have difficulties getting things done because of that division between those two parties. Who wants to go through that kind of stress in a democracy that's imposed upon them by the United States? So I think that that's also causing challenges. So what we have really is a breakdown in the coherence of the world order. The institutions no longer reflecting the material realities of the day. The ideas are losing legitimacy as we speak. And then the material capabilities are changing because countries rise and fall on the international hierarchy. So there's a crisis as well on consent. So subordinate actors are no longer willing to buy into that notion of human rights that the United States sort of tried to show the rest of the world because the United States itself is not adhering to those principles of human rights. We thought that globalization had done wonders for the world, but now we're almost rejecting the notion of globalization if you're from a poor subordinate country, because we've seen the results of globalization siphoning off the wealth from small states to the West and to the center. And you have to go back to, I think, Wallerstein that talks about the core periphery and the semi-periphery countries of the globe. Well, the peripheral countries are the ones that were not present in 1945 when the UN system was created. They didn't have a say in the writing of the rules of the game. They didn't have a say in deciding what kind of institutional structure the world should have. They didn't have a say because they were too poor, too impoverished to contribute financially to the financial institutions that would govern the globe. So those people were not present in 1945. Many of them were even on colonial rule. So since they became independent, and many of them knocked on the door of the UN saying, we want to be members of this organization, they were brought into the UN system. But they were brought in with pre-existing rules in place, right? They were brought into an institution that was already baked in terms of the structure of the institution. And that structure privileged the United States. The structure privileged the Western countries. The structure did not really pay attention to the challenges of the developing world. So things like climate change, poverty alleviation, all these things, human rights abuses, etc. All those things are still a problem for many countries in the developing world. And in fact, some of those things now have become problems for the center as well. So there is this crisis of consent. Subordinate actors don't want to buy into this system of rules and regulations. In fact, even Canada, which is a middle power for all intents and purposes, Mark Carney said, we are not going back to those old rules because those rules were created by the United States, and we kind of bought into it because we were trying to be the middle power, trying to make sure that the system runs as smoothly as possible. We bought into this notion, but we knew from the beginning that those rules disadvantage poor countries, disadvantage countries that were on the peripheral spectrum. So it was not the best kind of rule. So he said we're not going back to that old system because that old system now is ruptured, and we have to create a new system that's much more inclusive, much more inclusive of countries that were not present the first time around when the UN was created, and that would take into consideration the rise of new actors, the fact that certain actors are declining, all those things. So that's where the crisis of consent comes in. Compliance becomes much more coercive and less voluntary in this crisis moment. So the United States is using this moment to impose its will on countries, either by imposing tariffs on countries, so its economic might, trying to deal with things like drug trafficking by blowing boats out of the water in the Caribbean and in Asia. The whole compliance becomes more a coercion than a voluntary matter. It wants to beat Iran into submission. The United States does. It wants to join with Israel in its what they call genocidal thinking, trying to get rid of the Palestinians in Gaza, etc. So you have this crisis of consent. Then the other thing that I think really matters here when it comes to global governance structures is that there is institutional strain. We can see it every day. Existing global governance structures continue to persist, but they function very poorly because of the strain being placed upon them. Whether it's being, not rewarding countries or institutions with funding, budgetary funding to make their activities function properly, or stalling reform efforts that are put in place to try to make things more efficient, or by fragmenting the organizational structures of the UN system to make it less and less effective. This is institutional strain. And finally, I think there is a multiplicity of competing orders. No single actor now can impose a new hegemonic settlement upon the world. So instead, we have overlapping, competing projects of world order. And guess what? I think this is where Robert Cox comes in very important here. We may actually be moving to a world order that's non-hegemonic. And that's the key to understanding where we are. Since the United States is no longer the hegemon, we may in fact be moving to a post-hegemonic system that is not automatically leading to a stable multipolarity. Instead, it could be a fragmented, and that's where my contested notion comes in. It could be a fragmented, contested, and historically open-ended kind of world order. And there's some pluses and minuses to that. The plus is that within that fragmented, contested, historically open-ended world order that's emerging, there may be an opportunity for countries that were not part of the existing order or the old order to make changes that would transform the order. And that's where I get back to your point. I'm not calling for reform anymore. I used to do that when I was a graduate student. Now I'm calling for transformation. And there's a difference between transforming something and reforming something. Usually reform is reserved for keeping the status quo for as much as possible. In other words, you try to accommodate changes, but you keep the status quo as much as possible in place. Transformation doesn't do that. Transformation means that you get rid of the status quo altogether and you create something that's new. And I think the old order, which was based largely on liberal hegemony, is eroding to the point where we can see it happening in front of our eyes. A new order is not yet institutionalized, but there is possibility that a new order can actually take in consideration, for example, different types of institutions. We already have some of those institutions in place, like the G7, the G20, the G22, the G78. These are institutions that are already in place. The BRICS, for example, is a new kind of institution, and they're banking institutions that are transnational. There's transnational institutions that are being created as we speak. So the world is going to be a much more complex, interdependent world, to use a term used by Cohen and Robert Nye, Joseph Cohen and Robert Nye, complex interdependent world. And in a complex interdependent world, the governance will also have to be complex because it has to deal with networks, right? As opposed to a top-down imposed hegemonic order imposing upon the rest of the world. So here's a possibility that we can actually end up with a much more democratic system in the true sense of democratic, where poor, underprivileged, marginalized states may have a say in the creation of the next world order. So I think that's where I'm coming down. And this is obviously a normative position I'm taking, but it's a very important one in terms of trying to understand where we go next as the old order dies. And then we want to try to put in place a new order that will be relevant to this particular moment in time, but understand the traditional, how we got to this place in the first place. In other words, the longer range view of how we got to where we are today.
That was really excellent. I'm just curious if we could talk more about one, what exactly is the strategy of the United States which we take to be responsible for its loss of hegemony, basically? I mean, it's not just observing things that are bad. I'm asking about they must be having a strategy of some kind that they're trying to implement, whether it's implemented poorly or better than, or as expected, let's say. I think poorly. But I suspect there is a strategy, and it's good to talk about it because in that sense, I think you can get a feeling of what may come.
Mm-hmm.
And then on the other hand, connecting it to this, I'm really curious how you could end up with a kind of non-hegemonic world order or post-hegemonic post-hegemonic world order out of these circumstances. And there is a third element where I'm curious about what kind of elements of the liberal international order you think should still remain, maybe. For example, for me, things for discussion are the United Nations and are the Declaration of Human Rights, and I'm open to debate, and and uh, and related to that would be an additional question of what could have the United States done
Mm-hmm.
to ensure that after their hegemonic moment has passed,
Mm-hmm.
this order or some kind of order which still would benefit the United States would remain to some extent in place, even though it would be transformed or reformed.
Yeah.
Thank you.
All right, that's a really, really good question because first of all, I think I'm persuaded by Robert Coxian view that we're moving towards a post-hegemonic interregnum, a post-hegemonic world order, I should say. And the reason why I feel that way is exactly because the United States has no grand strategy anymore. They have no coherent grand strategy to address the problem. And this happens whenever a hegemonic power is on decline. If you go back to, again, Paul Kennedy's work on the rise and fall of the great powers, one of the significant things that he says in his arguments as to why great powers tend to fall is that they tend to overextend themselves. And the reason why they're overextending themselves is because they're trying to grapple, right, to hold on, to preserve the residual hegemony that they had. They were trying to hold on to the core of that hegemonic position despite the fact that they're losing out. They know that they're losing out, but they try to hold on to it as much as possible. When a large animal dies, it trashes around, before it actually finally gives up the ghost. This is like the United States right now. The US is working, I think, to retain dominance wherever it can because it still has some structural advantages. We know this. It still has the strongest military power. And we see this now playing itself out in the war against Iran. Um, it does have the power and the ability to, destroy buildings, to destroy military units, etc., and even maybe decapitate the leadership of Iran. But the problem with that is that brute force is no longer applicable in a world that's much more sort of multi-centric, if you will, because with multi-centrism comes a diffusement of power. You said you want to talk about power, but power becomes much more diffuse when there are many poles, multiple poles in the globe, as opposed to a bipolar system where you can have two poles fighting it out, or a unipolar system where there's one major pole. So in a multipolar system, which we happen to find ourselves in after 1989, 1990, and that's where I think that's where the interregnum really begins, because the end of the Cold War, the end of the Soviet Union, the sort of ability of the West to try to repackage itself, because now NATO had to find a reason for being, because the reason that it had before was to counter Warsaw Pact. So the Warsaw Pact is no longer. NATO had to try to create new reasons for being. And it did so in collaboration with the United States, which was leading NATO at the time. Now, of course, the United States is threatening NATO itself. So that adds another complication to the problem. But what it does show is that the United States as a hegemonic power is trying to retain its dominance wherever it can. And it still has some structural advantages like military primacy in terms of global force projection, alliances like NATO, which is now falling apart. As you know, many countries in NATO now don't want to even support the United States war against Iran. Then there's an issue of financial hegemony. The United States we still have the centrality of the dollar, but countries are starting to move away from that too. Countries are starting to buy things using the yen in Chinese currency. Several countries are starting to move away from the so-called petrodollar. And I think this war in Iran right now is showing the possibility that that could even get even worse for the United States. So the United States is going to try its best to hold on to its financial hegemony wherever possible, trying to control the International Monetary Fund and the World Bank, but it's going to face the challenge of um, the Chinese government and its Belt and Road Initiative, for example, which is really causing an alternative to those US controlled IMF World Bank systems. And then, of course, the big elephant in the room is the technological leadership. Technology has always driven what financial bodies do, what hegemonic powers do. The United States can no longer claim to be at the lead of the AI revolution, semiconductors, defense technology, etc., because there are other countries that are challenging as well, especially in AI, semiconductors. Even Iran as a small state, relatively weaker state, asymmetrically weaker state than the United States, but it has tremendous advantages in drone technology. And that's now playing itself out with its attacks on Israel, on the UAE countries, targeting, with the help in some cases of Russia, targeting US military bases around the Middle East. So this is not a foregone conclusion that the United States is going to be able to maintain its power. It's struggling to preserve that residual hegemony that continues to happen. Now, when hegemons fall, when world order changes, it's not as though you sort of go to the edge of the cliff and fall off the cliff. Many times in the transitional moment, there's still elements of hegemony that is residual, right? There's still certain things, military primacy in certain areas. There's still financial hegemony in certain areas. There's still technological leadership in some areas. But the main logic is that this attempt to maintain control over the commanding heights that the United States used to have uh, is no longer available to the United States. So that's the first thing. The second thing is what I call selective multilateralism. Sorry, there's a kind of an instrumental institutionalism that has developed um, by the United States, selective multilateralism. Rather than abandoning institutions altogether, the United States is now using them selectively. So it would use the United Nations system selectively until it no longer wants to use it. It would use the Security Council selectively until it decides to sort of create a board of whatever it's called now, the board of
Board of
peace.
Peace. Yeah.
Yeah. And
Which
that
which which was approved by the UN, I think.
yes, but there is a circumstances on which it was approved, which is comes into question, right? But the Board of Peace is not going to happen. It's not going to function. It's going to take many, many years before anything like this can work. And I think what the US will find out to its disgruntlement is that first of all, nobody wants to join the Board of Peace except for a number of states that are autocratic. If you look at the number of states that are part of that Board of Peace, they're autocratic states. They're willing to give whatever amount of money, $1 billion or whatever, to this organization, but there's no concept of how it's going to be run. Um, is it going to be led by the United States president? Will the United States president be around longer than 2 or 3 years? We don't know if he's going to survive physically, if he's going to be able to go past that. And then once he's out of office, in the United States, who will take over that Board of Peace, right? So there's lots of questions about this new arrangement. There was no consultation, for example, with NATO members. So no NATO member wants to be part of this. I remember when Canada was asked to be part of it, said initially, it could be. And then the United States president got upset by something that the Carney government did and decided that they wanted to disinvite the Canada. And we were very happy. We were applauding the fact that Canada was not part of this because we don't want Canada to be involved in anything having to do with sort of I would say it's a project of the Trump administration to make money on a situation that normally should have been dealt with by a strong Security Council, because that was the job of the Security Council, to deal with issues of peace and war around the globe. So there's a paralysis in terms of the existing institutions of multilateralism. There's a paralysis in the World Trade Organization dispute settlement system, mainly because Trump has his own ideas about tariffs. And that doesn't conform with the dispute settlement procedures in the World Trade Organization. There's a preference for so-called coalitions of the willing. You notice that that's happened a lot these days, right? Have a coalition of the willing around a certain area, and that replaces, in some cases, what the United Nations system was intended to do. So I think Robert Coss, if you look at how Robert Coss has expressed this, he says institutions are no longer expressions of hegemonic consensus. They become tools of statecraft. So many of these institutions are really tools of statecraft. They're not hegemonic consensus building institutions as the UN was when it was first
And,
created.
and I think if I can come in
Yeah,
here, I think here there is a strategy in the sense that that is the strategy. The strategy is to move to statecraft in economics, to replace economic policy with economic statecraft, and to activate trade, monetary, fiscal policy in light
yeah,
of national security and foreign policy goals, with the aim, I think, with the aim of remaining a hegemon and primarily curtailing or stopping China.
but here,
So. So,
That's very important. I think you're
so
right there.
yeah, I think when I look at what I've done, just to kind of try to connect it quickly in my head. So they had a huge problem, which was they have a massive deficit, right?
Mhm.
They had a massive deficit. They have a weak industrial base. They saw China had expanded everywhere through the Belt and Roads Initiative, where they built pipelines and of oil and gas and train tracks and ports and infrastructure and all sorts of things. And they're taking over Euro-Asia, which is a key geopolitical concept in terms of sort of thinking that whoever controls Eurasia controls the world island, because it has the largest population, the largest amount of resources. So when you look at that, you can kind of see that, first of all, they are in debt because of the wars they've done before, spending trillions. Economically, they do not have the same power they used to have, which means they can't really fund all these global police system, which they kind of have in place. And and so there are different actions taking place that do make sense for me from one angle. So, for example, you try to lower the deficit in a bunch of different ways. One is you try to lower the dollar, which was going well for a long time. You impose, you use economic statecraft in terms of trade restrictions, which they've done. And the aim of the trade restrictions, a lot of the aim was to construct a unitary bloc in their hemisphere, which would have a same external tariff for China, right? So it's about China to a large extent, not only about the US, but also about China. It's also about restarting their own industry, because that industry is the key to being autonomous in terms of supply chains, but it's also key to the war effort if such an effort has to happen. So there are those moves, and part of that move then is how to get supply chains to control supply chains and choke points, and how to control areas around the world where you control sea routes.
Mhm.
And if you can at the same time get more oil, that would keep the prices down, which would be actually going higher because of the tariffs. So to keep the prices down, you would need to have a lot of oil, cheap oil, the cheapest oil possible, keep the price of oil down.
Mhm.
So, and on top of that, you would try to push Europe to pay for NATO so that you can move that money and those assets to the Pacific, where you could strengthen. Uh, Not necessarily with the idea that you would go to war with China, because that could be catastrophic for the planet, but that you contain them. And and there's other things that I think you can look at, but I think Scott Besson, for example, much of the time he follows a playbook of this kind, and maybe Marco Rubio to some extent, not only, but also kind of follows something similar. And when people say Trump is playing 5D chess, I think that's ridiculous. But it doesn't mean there isn't some kind of high risk, high stakes, realist kind of scenario that they think that they are doing, and that they think with the might of AI, which would emerge on top of all of this, you could extend the hegemony for much longer. So I think this is what I see. And also what I see is the demise of values and the move and the hegemonic suicide, which comes with this, which normally signals problems.
Mhm.
And what I see is the military intervention in Iran, which is really destroying a lot of this strategy, because the dollar is super high, price of oil is super high. China doesn't suffer as much as people think from being disconnected from the oil from Iran. And so uh, it does look many times that this high risk, very high risk strategy was always likely to backfire, because it's very unorthodox and high risk. But also at the level of implementation, there seem to be other considerations coming into the picture, whether it relates to family and friends and insider trading or deals or things like Iran, where I think the US has stepped in for whatever reasons, and now it can get out, and it's likely to become a very important episode for everyone. The problem I have with all these scenarios is that the whole world depends on the economy of the United States. so, so
Well,
you know, like if that deficit explodes because the treasuries explode because of all the consequences of what's coming down the line, you have a global recession, you have a global financial crisis. If they decide that they want Greenland, then you have another problem coming. So the whole strategy is very bad for your allies, and it's very it leads towards conflict
yeah.
inevitably. Sorry.
No, no, I think you're absolutely right. One of the things I would say is that because the US no longer can really shape world order the way it used to, that it was a hegemonic power. Um, what it can, the only thing it can try to do right now in terms of strategy is to try to shape the trajectory of the transition, whatever this transition is. And it can do so by trying to delay, in some cases, or fragment any alternative type of order that might be in play. It can also try to retain dominance in certain domains, technology, finance, military, etc. In short, I think not it wouldn't have hegemonic control the way it used to have, but hegemonic influence under certain constraints. So if you look at this is a realistic way of looking at this. There are at least five different interlocking strategic moves that the US is trying to do. I can see from behind the scene. Is first of all trying to deny the rise of a new hegemon, in particular China, right? It doesn't want to have a China-centric hegemonic power there. So it would try to deny as much as possible the rise of China in many different areas. Now, so this starts with the military balancing in Indo-Pacific, for example, maybe doing some technological restrictions on things like semiconductors and AI and the AI ecosystem, etc. And then the most important part, because the US is still very much an economic power too, is economic de-risking and supply chains diversification so that it can obstruct any movement that China might have and prevent China from converting its economic power, which it does have a lot of, and probably will surpass the United States fairly soon. But it was try to the US would try to prevent China from converting its economic power into a coherent institutional, ideational alternative order. Now you see what's happening right now. China is actually replacing the United States whenever it does something negative to the global order. China is actually more supportive now of the global order than the United States is, the 1945 global order that is. So it's already starting to show that it's capable, in some cases, of creating an alternative position to the US hegemony. The big thing though, and when I talk to many of my Chinese colleagues here at the university, at the China Center, but also in China, China doesn't want to become a hegemonic power. In fact, it made it quite clear to me, especially when Xi Jinping came to Trinidad when I was there in 2014. One of the things that it was quite clear he didn't want to do was to become a global hegemonic power. He didn't want China to become a global hegemonic power simply because with hegemony comes responsibility. And China is not yet out of the woods when it comes to taking all of its people out of poverty. It's done a very good job there, but it still has a way to go. It has a lot of different things around the globe through the Belt and Road Initiative and so on. It has to manage and take care of. It doesn't need to have, on top of all those things, this strain of becoming a hegemonic power for the globe. So it's quite okay for China to remain a hegemonic power for the region, but it doesn't really want to become a global hegemonic power. And this sort of leads me back to Robert Costa's notion of a possible post-hegemonic global order, because the automatic person that you would think about when it comes to the rise of the material power would be China, to replace the United States. But in fact, it doesn't really want to go in that direction. It wants to remain a stable, big power in the region, perhaps even take control of Taiwan eventually and so on, but it doesn't want to necessarily replace the United States with hegemony. In fact, it sees hegemony as a bad word. And some Chinese scholars tell me that hegemony is not even in their dictionary, right? They don't have the term hegemony in their dictionary. It's viewed as a very bad thing. So the United States has no other choice but to rewire globalization, because there's a lot going on right now with what's called deglobalization happening around the world, and the United States used to be one of the architects of globalization. So it's now trying to restructure globalization in a way that would benefit itself, rather than abandon the globalization altogether, which is what the deglobalization advocates want to see. It's now trying to restructure globalization, and it's doing so with industrial policies, the chips, the green tech subsidies, etc. It's also doing so by shoring up friends and trusted supply chains. It's also doing so by strategic use of sanctions, tariffs, and other financial instruments. And I think this reflects a shift from efficiency to resilience plus security. So you have this notion of moving towards a resiliency, which is a way of saying that we want to maintain whatever power we have left. And also we want to shore up our military strategic power, because we are still in the lead in that area. The third point I think I want to make is that the United States is really into what is called selective multilateralism. So it hasn't really abandoned multilateralism altogether, but it now tries to create coalitions rather than universality of multilateralism. So rather than relying on primary or universal institutions like the United Nations system, it has a preference for what is called mini-lateral groupings. I think there's a guy I did a paper with this guy at the G20 conference, and he talked about this sort of mini-lateral groupings, you know, UK, US, the Quad, and various issue-based kinds of coalitions that have been cropping up. This seems to be in keeping with what I talked about in the paper that you mentioned, about this concatenated set of institutions, rather than a particular type of multilateralism. You have these different types of multilateralisms in plural. So the implication here is that fragmentation of the global governance system by the United States is preferred rather than any sort of systemic coherence, because it's not able to have that systemic coherence. It cannot even get Canada on board many things that it wants to do. It cannot. It's using the big stick rather than collaboration, consensus building, and so on. And that doesn't play very well with Canadians. It doesn't play very well with Norwegians. It doesn't play very well with Austrians. It doesn't play very well with members of NATO. So this idea that you can somehow have selective multilateralism may be the only route that the United States have to hold on to some parts of its hegemony. But it will soon find out, as the Soviet Union found out, that by overextending itself, it really plants the seeds of its own destruction as a hegemonic power. So the United States is not retreating necessarily from alliances, right? It's trying to recalibrate the alliances. It gives NATO a hard time for not contributing more money into NATO, for example. But NATO now is starting to think maybe we can operate without the United States. And that's kind of scary, to think that the NATO countries may want to sort of form their own sort of security arrangement that doesn't quite include the United States.
What,
There
because
is,
of Greenland? That was one of the key moments that
but
triggered
yes,
that. Yeah.
it was is foolhardy to want to trigger that just because of Greenland. But most NATO countries that said enough is enough. We don't want to deal with the United States if they continually threaten to take over Greenland. And this 51st state thing with Canada. I can tell you as a Canadian, I don't buy U.S. products anymore. I don't travel to the United States anymore. I mean, this is just a personal beef I have with the United States right now. But there are a lot of people in that category who have given up going to the United States. Their tourism is taking a real hit right now in Vegas, in Miami. The kids that used to go down to Miami for holidays and stuff like this, they're no longer doing that. I mean, this has become a real challenge for us and our closest ally. I think it was Lloyd Asworthy who says once that living next to the United States and uh, interacting with the United States is like making love to a porcupine. I mean, it's that difficult, So I think what we're witnessing now is the U.S. trying its best to consolidate alliances, but doesn't have the skill sets, at least not this administration, to be diplomatic about it.
But
And
also, it doesn't have the level of ideas that you mentioned. So, because they've undermined the level of ideas and then the level of institutions
yeah,
in the process. But
yeah,
especially the level of ideas has been undermined. And I mean, I have to speak for Europe and say our leaders and also a lot of the Europeans are
mm,
very, and that we have always been in a sense pro-American.
mm,
Even if you acknowledge the empire and hegemony, we have grown up with that. It was part of everything. It was kind of the normal ideal order. And it's very hard even now for European leaders to contemplate having to move away. So
yeah,
it's really only forced through all the circumstances that Europe is going to make that move, but
yeah,
it's been pushed hard,
yes,
but yeah, we're just saying like it's important to acknowledge that this idea, being an imperial subject, is actually normal here. Is
mm,
if I have to think about how I see myself and all of that, I will have to really face that question of where do I stand, and will people here be happy once the American hegemony has fully dissipated? I don't
yeah.
think so. So
But
because the attachment is real.
yeah, here's the thing though. Think about other hegemons in the past. And think about how people simply moved away from those hegemons fairly quickly once they started to fall. And I think you're going to find the same thing happening here.
Britain and the Suez Canal not so long ago,
Yes,
which
exactly.
has some parallels, potentially, not necessarily. That is one of them. But I want to push back a bit on China because of some of the literature I was looking at, which is possibly biased. But the I was looking at Alfred McCoy, who is a historian, and he is very much of the opinion that China is emerging instead of the United States, and the United States has run its course in terms of a world hegemon. But he has issues with how China will engage that side of the hegemonic world order that we call today the liberal international order, and so similar for the Declaration of Human Rights. So he thinks that China is not able yet to really accept or take on this discourse of human rights, and also that they are not likely to fully respect the principle of state sovereignty uh, as much as, well, I can't compare with the United States, because that is a problem there from the beginning. But like, so that's one thing that he says. The other thing that he says is their type of culture, he thinks, pushes them towards a sort of hyper-nationalist hegemony where they will privilege national sovereignty over universal principles, and they will focus on bilateral economic exchanges within individual nations or regional blocs. while continuing to remain unaccustomed to and dismissive of the legalistic negotiations of international organizations. So it kind of saying that, in a sense, what he's kind of suggesting in several ways is that they might not have that appeal and also that interest of participating in what we would call the liberal international order, which, as we all know, but we haven't really talked about it enough, implies trade and like free trade and so-called free trade, because it is free, but then it comes with all sorts of um, asymmetries in the process, like the, who has the currency, global currency reserve, and who makes the rules and all of that. So what I'm trying to throw here is a more pessimistic vision, which I'm not trying to promote at all, but I'm just trying to say this is also in play for some people, that you might have a transition from a US-led world order to a more diffuse China-led world order, because China doesn't seem to have all the attributes that the United States used to have in terms of asserting itself in a similar way, uh, at least not for now. And that's also a reason for which somebody could question to some extent what you said before, in terms of, saying, well, China is, for them, is not the right moment to maybe to assert this kind of position. So it also would trigger the United States as much as possible if they were to say that we are trying to become a global hegemon, or like that could be a declaration of war in some ways. So uh, somebody could have that angle. But anyways, what I wanted to say is, Alfred McCoy, for example, at some point speaks about how you might have this China-led world order, but this is more diffuse, and it might imply, maybe would imply something like returning to some US returning to some version of hemispheric hegemony, which with Vance isolationism is very possible in the current context, and effectively accepting the creation of spheres of influence, such as those of US, China, and Russia. And here some have thought about a return to concert of powers or something of that nature. And then for McCoy, that's not really what he sees. What he probably suspects is that this Chinese global hegemony would lead to a looser world order than its American predecessor. And because for the first time in 500 years, the world could face an imperial transition without a clear successor as global hegemon, leading to a more diffuse world order in which each hegemony would dominate its immediate region. And so he thinks, and I'm going to quote this, he thinks, Brasilia would basically dominate over South America, Washington, North America, Beijing, East and Southeast Asia, Moscow, Eastern Europe, New Delhi, South Asia, Tehran, Central Asia, Pretoria, Southern Africa, Ankara and Cairo, the Middle East. I mean, it's just an imaginative exercise. It's not like a serious theory. But at times it does look like that as the fabric kind of breaks down. And it could be that you have different phases that succeed each other, and that there's no way to predict exactly what would happening, whether it will be a bipolar or multipolar system, a concert of powers, spheres of influence, a more anarchic international system, or some blended combination of all these things. But what is certain is that I think in history, these periods where um, the period of interregnum is a period of zero-sum competition for imperial hegemony, which remains undecided, that is dangerous for everyone, because these are the periods where the greatest conflicts occur, really, or the greatest crisis, as no one can assert uh, either their hegemony or any kind of hegemonic system or post-hegemonic system over the other. And it seems to me like our entire global history, I don't know this, but it feels to me that might be the case, has been this endless zero-sum competition. Constant,
Yeah.
just constant and constant. King counts, conquers, loses, somebody else conquers, the guy who conquered, somebody else conquers him, and it's just, this is history. And it looks very much like that. And of course, people today who see what is happening, they basically revert to that realist position that this has always been the case from Thucydides onward. We know that this is how the world works and there is nothing else and all of that. And I I am interested in seeing the world as it is, but I'm also interested in seeing how how exactly you might think that a post-hegemonic world order, or even a hegemonic world order that is balanced. I don't know how that could look. How how not necessarily how would you see that emerging, but where should ordinary people put their focus? So from, do we need a global social movement of some kind? Should people in the academia really think about a certain direction? What is the, as you said, there's normative unclarity at the moment or something of that kind. What is the normative level that could coalesce some of these things? And it seems to me that you are working on that normative level, and you have been all this time. But you are adjusting it to the circumstances of where we are.
Yeah.
Yeah. Does it make sense?
Yeah, it does make sense. And but if you think about this moment that we're living in right now, through using a Coxian lens, because I refer back to Cox because I think he was probably the most articulate person after some of the other philosophers, but he's one of the most articulate persons in this period before he passed away. But he did try to try to project what we are moving towards. I mean, first of all, looking at it through his lens, I think that we are not simply witnessing a shift in power from the United States to China. As I said before, I think China is really not willing to undertake that shift. In other words, is not willing to take the burden of global hegemony. It's not ready for that. From everything I can tell from talking to people from within the Chinese circle, the people that are close to Xi Jinping and others like him, they're saying that China is not interested in taking on that challenge right now. But what we're actually seeing, I think, is the breakdown of a historically specific configuration of power. You have to say, just because that something was created in 1945 doesn't mean it's going to persist forever. So there was a particular historically specific configuration of power, institutions, and ideas that sustained US hegemony in 1945. It was very specific to the US winning the war with its allies and so on. But the United States right now is no longer capable of fully stabilizing the system that is in itself created. In fact, it's actually reversing a lot about that system. It's retreating away from that system. And in some cases, China is trying to fill the void in some cases when the US retreats. So, for example, the US retreated from Africa and China moved into Africa. We've seen in the Caribbean, I was there present for 3 years as the director of the Institute of International Relations. Xi Jinping's first visit out of China was to Port of Spain. The first ever visit as a leader of China was to Port of Spain in Trinidad and Tobago. And a lot of people ask, well, why did he choose that? But Trinidad and Tobago was sort of a regional hub for all the other members of CARICOM at the time, Caribbean community. And there's still members within the CARICOM community that support Taiwan over mainland China, right? And I think Xi Jinping did a very good job of selling the idea of the Belt and Road Initiative coming into the Caribbean region and Latin American region. So they're willing to do those kind of things, but they're not willing to go to the next step, which is to take on the kind of hegemony that the United States was very much controlled by. This notion of using the big stick, using the hammer. That's something that I don't think the Chinese really want to do. But I could be wrong. Maybe this is just a moment, and then it'll change its position later on. But I think instead of pursuing a strategy of trying to shape the interregnum period and preserve advantages in certain domains.
But I would argue one of the main advantages is for the current rules to continue because that ensures their economic growth,
Yeah,
which will surpass the United States.
yeah,
So if
yeah. I think that's true. That's true, and I don't think it has any problem with that. Because it wants to, it wants to show and demonstrate actually that it could compete with the United States and on a one-on-one. But I don't think it wants to necessarily be responsible for completely rewriting the rules of the game in the way that the United States was in 1945. But so it would be a much more diffuse kind of relationship, right? A much more diffuse kind of order.
I also
Uh,
agree with you, but I think that they really don't want to go over another state's sovereignty, especially if it's an ally. So a lot of people here have asked, in Europe,
Mhm.
there was that moment where Trump looked like was pushing us about Greenland, and everybody was in a state of shock. And at that moment, a lot of analysts thought that if China would come and help with, for example, the war in Russia, like make sure that they could influence in some way Russia to look at stopping the conflict, maybe
Mhm.
something of that nature, or like come in on the side of the liberal international order in a way that would have possibly defended European countries at that moment.
Mhm. Mhm.
They would have that would have potentially really tipped the balance for some European countries, more European countries towards China.
Mhm.
But
Mhm.
I think one reason they haven't even considered that is because that would mean violating the sovereignty of Russia at some
Mhm.
level that they don't find acceptable. So I think
Yeah.
that there is something of that kind. But that's because that's their worldview. The worldview is that national sovereignty is key in that system. And so the problem that I have is not so much what are their intentions, which remains to be seen, but if their framework is based on national sovereignty, what Alfred McCoy calls hyper-nationalist hegemony. uh, how would that, how can that generate the post-hegemonic world order? Because the post-hegemonic world order implies a move from hyper-nationalism, a move away, I think. You have to cede sovereignty, national sovereignty.
Yeah, and I think this is where the challenge comes in. Um, the Europeans are just as much to blame as the United States is for what's going on right now. And I say this as a person who grew up in Barbados in the Caribbean and watched how the British took advantage of
Please
this.
tell us.
Huh?
Please tell
Well,
us.
you know,
we,
seriously, I
we
mean,
don't hear it much, so it's good. Yeah, really.
it's
I'm
important.
honest.
It's important to know this, right? Because we are very critical of Britain. Because for one thing, they've never really acknowledged the fact that they grew as an economic power on the backs of poor Black people who worked for nothing as slaves, right? And they're not willing to recompense those slaves. They were willing to give money and recompense the slave owners for loss of their property. you know, when the
It
British,
was insane as well, the
it's
amount.
crazy, yeah. So I think we have to be very clear-headed about liberal internationalism and liberal world order, because the liberal world order didn't necessarily benefit 80% of the population of the globe. It's a liberal world order that benefited in large part the United States. Think about uh, the Bretton Woods institutions, how they have benefited the United States more so than they benefited the countries that they're supposed to be serving, small developing countries. So, the large number of countries that were not even present in 1945 when the UN was created they have no real love for the liberal international order because they were never part of it. And in fact, they didn't benefit from it. Unless you want to say, well, now they've become independent states, they become democratic states. But even in that democracy, there's still something called um, uh, a subordination, right, of those countries to the big powers in the West. There's still a Western kind of Western centric kind of power.
Some countries have done really well at using the subordinate status to make the United Nations more inclusive, but it's still far away from what we would have wanted in the 1970s.
Precisely. Yeah, yeah. Because I'm glad you pointed that out. Because remember, in the 1970s, they were pushing for a new global economic order too, the new International Economic Order, NIEO. And it never happened because guess what? The people at the center, if you use a Wallersteinian notion of center, periphery, semi-periphery, the countries at the center didn't want to have it because it meant that they would lose their privilege over some of the subordinate countries. So the third world countries failed there to gain to have a new world order, new world international order. And guess what? The Chinese are the only ones in that category that decided to support the new international economic order. They, in fact, consider themselves to be, China considers itself to be the leader of the G78. Remember that G78 in the 1970s? But the Chinese still think that they are the leader of the G78, despite the fact that it's done very well for itself economically and so on. It still has this notion of partnerships, right? Partnerships with developing countries as opposed to dominant subdominant relationships. The problem with the Europeans and the problem for the United States is that they're still holding on to this liberal order that creates a sense of structural dominance uh, over subordinate countries. And therefore developing countries, just large percentage of the population of the world are in the developing world. They don't really buy into this notion of a liberal order. So I think we have to be careful not to be too wedded to the notion that we're losing the world economic order, that we're losing this
We
liberal.
we are in Europe, but it's very hard to switch that
No,
view. That's what I
I know.
mean when I say that we
Yeah,
are very much American in that
yes,
sense.
and
Yeah,
the reality though
this
is
would
that
be felt as a huge loss. It would like
same,
it would
yeah,
be, yeah.
and it will be
And
a huge loss for the privilege of
and if I ask like questions like what multinational institutions would should we retain then, or are we looking at it just clean the board and start again type of thing?
yeah,
What is happening there?
right. So my view is um, reform and incremental changes will not cut it anymore. And that's from someone who spent a lot of time studying reform of the United Nations. That's not going to cut it anymore because the world wants to have, I think the majority of people in the world wants to see a transformation of world order now, to the point where I think we're ready for that transformation in a way that we weren't before. Now, the ones that are resistant to that transformation happen to be Europeans and the United States. Um, the less resistant ones happen to be outside of that that particular ambit. So I do think that this notion of transformation now has to be studied more carefully. If you're going to transform something, it means that you're going to change what exists and embrace something that's completely different. And I go back to those three pillars that Robert Cost talks about because in every single world order, there are these three pillars. So the ideational element has to be transformed. So we can't look at the ideas that sort of supported the order of 1945 and say, well, those ideas are going to persist. Of course, they will continue. Some of those ideas will continue. Things like human rights will continue. Maybe a multilateral system that involves the United Nations system could continue, but there'll be alternatives to these ideas. There'll be contestation that will continue for a while. before you sort of get a consensus over what the new ideational pillar should be. We're moving up and down the ladder in terms of multilateral, in terms of material capabilities. There are countries today that would never have even made it to the Security Council in 1945 because they didn't have the kind of material power that they have today. We now have India and Pakistan with nuclear weapons, Israel with nuclear weapons, North Korea with nuclear weapons. Probably Iran may have nuclear weapons someday. I mean, we now have a change in material capabilities, and that has to be reflected in whatever new system of governance pervades. So that's something that we have to think through carefully. Countries that held on to their notion that the world was realist in the sense of being able to dominate other countries and so on, they're finding it difficult to do so. The United States is having difficulty in winning the war against Iran. And that has to do with the fact that within Iran, as an asymmetric power, they're causing all sorts of problems for the United States and Israel.
But it also has to do with globalization, the fact that globalization is real,
Yes,
because
yes.
they can choke that nerve of the globalized system because it exists.
That's right. That's right. And because we depend so heavily on it, right? To get oil and gas and so on, and not only that, fertilizer and other things to the Strait
So
of Hormuz.
so you might be saying that in fact the idea of classical idea of hegemony and empire is beginning to fail because we might live in a world in which no one can assert that, and that concept itself becomes redundant.
And that's the point I was trying to make when I say that in a multipolar world, as opposed to a bipolar and a unipolar world, in a multipolar world, power is diffused. You because you have to think of it more in terms of networks, right? Nodes, spikes, and so on. That's a completely different kind of way of looking at the world than a dominant subdominant world, right? It's not going to be that straightforward any longer.
But I want to push back on that because I agree with you, obviously,
Mhm.
but I'm also aware that networks come. If I think of somebody like Manuel Castells,
Yeah,
um, initially his view was the view you mentioned. Later on, he wrote a book about media, power in the media, or
that's
something
enough.
like that. And in
Mhm.
that book, he starts acknowledging some limitations in terms of power dimension, and he's basically saying, in my understanding, that yeah, a network decentralizes or it's diffuse, but it depends on the protocol of the network. And if the protocol is written in a particular way, even though the network is decentralized, it's actually centralized in the way it operates
Mhm.
because those who control the protocol control the network. And so I think it's an open question of how new forms of power would this and hegemony would assert themselves. We might be that what we see as moving from something that was hegemonic to something non-hegemonic is actually moving from a level of power in a hegemony to a much more subtle level of power where you just conduct things through protocol and data.
Uh-huh.
Because that's how modern institutions work. That's how universities work. You have a protocol and you just send it down, and everybody works with that. Some subvert it, some it's decentralized to some extent, but then the data, the 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 the, the data collected in dashboards
Mhm.
that monitors the results of the protocol and creates governance from above
Right.
that is really hard to escape. So it's in a sense it's a very with the added technology, it's a very
Right.
pervasive and problematic social system at the moment. If you look at smaller institutions, yeah.
Well, I like the way you put it, but I also want to say that we have to rethink too um, networked multipolar world, right? There needs to be some sort of conceptual clarity on this. I think a networked multipolar world is not just about multiple great powers, right? as we had in the 19th century. You know, that's a multipolarity that we had in the 19th century. What I'm talking about here too is a challenge even to the state system itself, the challenge to states themselves, because the multipolar world of the 19th century was characterized by distributed power across nodes, not just states, right? I think that's where we're moving. This distributed power across nodes as opposed to just simply states. So, for example, in issue-specific alignments, for example, there are nodes that are responsible, not fixed blocks of states, for example. So even within a state, there could be a node that connects with another node in another state. So the states are not the primary actors here anymore. There's a kind of a dense interdependence across domains, like for finance, for example. There are several different actors in finance area, technology, security, information, etc. So I think that's where I think power then becomes diffuse. It's power flows through those networks and not through hierarchies in the way that we looked at it back in the 19th century and even the 20th century. So I think the key features of this so-called network multipolar order, apart from the multiple poles, is the unequalness nature of the capabilities. So major states like the United States and China, India, even the European Union, will probably be able to amass a certain amount of power, but no single actor can impose any systemic coherence on this new system that's going to be created. So I think that's where we have a slightly different interpretation, right, of what this world
I
will look
think
like.
I agree with that.
Yeah.
And I think it's a great insight. And I love the texture in your analysis.
Mhm.
Well,
Because it's one of those things that we have a difficulty getting away from because we're so state-centric in terms of our views, right? When I was a student and I heard some professors talk to me about the fact the state was a figment of our imagination, I can grapple with it because coming from a country like Barbados, we wanted to become a state. We wanted to become an independent state, like every every other state. It was hard to sort of wrap our heads around the fact that maybe the state was a fiction as opposed to reality. And that really what really we need to do was to look at the people within the state and try to see how we can make sure that their lives are better served by the actions of this artificial thing we call the state. So to move away from that is very, very difficult. So the thing about European countries, for example, not as countries, but as nodes, or have nodes within those countries connecting with other nodes, is a very, very difficult concept to wrap your head around. So, but I think that power now is being exercised through multinational corporations, through financial systems, through AI platforms, digital platforms, perhaps through transnational advocacy networks that we have. Some of them are already in place, and we're going to have to depend more on those for the new ideas that will now become the pillars of this new world order. The fact that the power is so diffuse means that the material capability element is going to be different, and then the institutions that we use will vary depending on the subject. So you're going to have a lot of coalitions of the willing around certain areas like climate change, coalition of the willing among certain areas like poverty reduction or something. But those things, we have to remember that those things can actually grow, expand, or shrink depending on the success or the failure of acting in those areas. So I know it's much more complex. My view now is much more complex than it was before. Um, the whole notion of mini-lateralism is coming into play right now in my mind, and also the notion of fragmented governance, where you have what I call multi-level governance. I talk a lot about the intermestic nature of governance now. The idea of an intermestic world is something that I've been spending quite a bit of time trying to explain to my students, right? That there used to be this sort of notion of the container concept, right? The state is like a container what goes on within the state you don't care about, really. It's one container hitting against another container. I call it the billiard ball theory of international relations. That's no longer relevant because we know that things that happen within the state has implications for things outside the state and vice versa. So there's no hard and fast boundary. I mean, we can build as many walls as we want, as Trump wanted to do. It's not going to stop the penetration of the boundaries of the state by other forces. We have technological issues there. AI is another example. There's pandemics. Don't pay attention to the borders of states. The environmental issues that we are facing right now, don't pay attention to borders of states. So I think we have to think of the world in a different way and think about the intermestic nature of global governance. If you have a situation where there is that kind of fluidity between the international and domestic and vice versa, you better try to find a different way to govern under the circumstances. Because the old way of governing, the notion that you can create some sort of UN system at the top, and then all these other things would sort of flow from it, that's no longer the case. There's some things in which some areas where the UN just cannot be the first go-to governance issue.
So it is like the state in some instances. It
Exactly,
needs
exactly.
other agents.
That's right, exactly. So here's the thing. I think one of the principles that will support this new form of governance when it does emerge is going to be subsidiarity. And as a European, you probably know subsidiarity very well. So there are two different types of subsidiarity, as I argue in my papers, right? One is a top-down version, and the other is a bottom-up version. I much prefer the bottom-up version of subsidiarity because you start from the lowest level. I saw this in when I was in Zurich a lot. They wanted to build a bicycle path through the mountains there in Zurich. And guess what? It got stymied because people live in that area felt it was going to bring too much damage, garbage, and that sort of stuff, and it's going to disrupt the nice, peaceful people in Zurich. So they had to go to a different level to get approval. So the idea that you can sort of control your destiny at the local lowest level possible is, I think, part of the subsidiarity principle. And then if there's no competence at that level, then you move it to a different level. So this idea of multi-level governance has to be done with the principle of subsidiarity in mind. And it has to be a bottom-up kind of principle as opposed to top-down. This would actually be very good for the United Nations system because instead of dumping all of the problems of the globe on the UN system as a first resort, the UN could become the last resort. So you try to deal with problems in their local sectors, local areas first. Sometimes it's beneath the state, so it's subnational problems that need to be addressed. And then if there's no competency there, legal competency, material competency, lack of funding, whatever, you move it up to.
And that gives space to civil society
Exactly.
organizations.
Exactly. And this is where I didn't get a chance to talk about this yet, but civil society is very important here because the whole notion of democracy is going to change. We're not going to have this kind of notion of democracy that's based only on elections. I talked about this in my recent presentation in Seoul, in Korea. We were talking about the backsliding principle of democracy, right? A lot of states are backsliding from democracy. Doesn't mean that they're not democratic. It means that they have a different view of democracy that's based mostly on local nodes, subnational nodes, making decisions about what affect them at that level. And that's as democratic to me as having a parliament somewhere outside of the local areas that made decisions for these local areas without even consulting with them. How do you have the UN and the IMF and the World Bank deciding on what economic measures should be taken in a developing country without having a local person with a lived experience in that region helping to make that decision? Right. So I think the whole notion of democracy is going to be upended because it's a kind of a artificial notion of democracy that's based on principles of a time when populations were so small that you can have a guy standing on a soapbox and getting people to agree with him. No, we can't do that anymore. But we can do it somewhat with the new technologies, but it's going to be interceded by so many other factors, like who controls the media, who controls the, who spends money on the media, who's going to be in charge of the media. That can change the message that comes across from the media. So we have to get away from that old way of looking at the world and try to imagine a different kind of world in which civil society becomes more important, in which the state becomes less important as an entity, because the state, yes, it has some responsibilities that could actually be maintained as a state level, at the state level, but it shouldn't be the first resort. It should be the last resort, as in the same way that the UN should be the last resort as well. So I think this is a new way of thinking about the world, and in some ways it has more in common with a Baha'i view of community than or sort of secular view of community. You see, because in the Baha'i communities, you have these nodes too, right? That are creating almost like organically, and they make decisions for themselves and so on, and it goes up to the national level, or goes up to the to Haifa. I mean, it's a different kind of thing. And yes, so you have um, certain things being dictated to by Haifa that could be passed on to the rest of the globe, because it has a universal element to it, attached to it, right? So we have to have maybe both concepts of subsidiarity in play, but pay more attention to the bottom up one, because that's the one that's least formed, least developed, and the hardest to really put in place, I think, at this moment.
I think this is what's so special about your perspective, that you change the unit of analysis in a way, but they also highlight processes that we don't value, we don't see,
A lot of value
and
in,
we
yeah.
don't describe importance to at the same time. And I think that changes. So one of my next questions was going to be about the global challenges that come in 2060 to 2100 or earlier, depending, because there's lots of them that are
Yeah.
interconnected, and there's lots of tipping points. I think some of the biggest ones are climate change, urbanization, and food and water, and migration. They're all linked, and based on this kind of change of unit of analysis and processes you look at, I can kind of imagine a world in which, as things hit different intermestic networks
Mhm.
appear in
Yes.
response, and
Yes.
then from there on something else coagulates. I can't really see the steps, but I can at least imagine that if things happen, bad things happen, and the United Nations has not done anything, or the G7 or the G20 or whichever G, um, that maybe still things are progressing because the local community and the network that is maybe even transcending the state with the local community has actually prepared a plan in place, and that
Mhm.
maybe is spreading across in other areas, and it's moving from the bottom upwards through subsidiarity, as you mentioned.
Mhm. Mhm.
Yeah, and that gives some hope. Yeah.
Right. No, and I think this is important to recognize and understand that we're moving away from the classic multipolar world, right?
Mhm.
And this networked one in which power is so diffused that alliances themselves are fluid. So as you mentioned, when you have a problem that crops up, maybe you have a certain set of actors around that particular node dealing with the problem. But if the problem is transitioned into something else, you might have a different selection of actors dealing with that change problem. So no actor really can stabilize the system in the way that we had, in 1945, having a big power, hegemonic power sort of stabilize the system. That's not going to happen anymore, because this in this interregnum period right now is already demonstrating that actors form alliances, and those alliances are very fluid. There's a guy that you should read sometime when you get a chance, is Jorge Heine. He's a
Mm.
Chilean. He was a Chilean ambassador to China. He was a good friend of mine. We talk a lot about this kind of topic. And one of the things that he's been putting forward recently is the notion of active non-alignment.
Mm.
You remember the 1970s, 80s, I guess
Yeah.
maybe there were talks about alignment, non-alignment, right? The non-aligned states are the ones that you just sat on the fence and didn't want to take either side of the U.S. or USSR, and so they were non-aligned. He's talking about a different concept of non-alignment. Is an active non-alignment, which means that states that feel that they're on periphery of the international system can deliberately develop a strategic policy of not being aligned to any state or any power, and actually or shift their alliances when it's necessary to one part or the other. So, for example, countries in the Caribbean that practice non-alignment in this active way may at times feel it's okay to align with China on certain issues, infrastructural projects that the United States have no interest in helping. But they may want to form an alliance with the United States on other issues. So this active non-alignment is a new concept again that I think sort of is relevant to the period in which we live, which is this interregnum, because everything is so fluid. So the interregnum itself has inherent instability in it. And that can be used as a negative, but it can also be used as a positive. If you're looking at the future where we want to be, you can think of it, you can think of the possibility that we as agents can actually create the new system. We can create the
Mm.
idea for the new system. We can
Mm.
create the institutional pillars for the new system. And we can be part of, through acting non-alignment, we can join or we can pull away from uh, nodes, but strengthen other nodes by being part of those nodes, and that can create a different kind of material capability, if you will,
Mm.
for the system. So it's quite different than what we were used to with the UN system being domineered by the United States and the European countries. Now we have a system where those countries will feel as though they're losing out because they're losing their privilege of being on top, being part of the core group of states, because now we live in a diverse, multipolar world.
It is extremely interesting, and I think a really enlightening analysis. And it makes you wonder how will consensus be reached.
Yeah.
The only thing I want to throw in is, and I've already mentioned some of the challenges that I think will be coming in the near future, this century for sure, I would say, uh, based on at least based on the studies from institutions like the United Nations and so forth. That changes things because we don't have this continuous time frame to engage in zero-sum games anymore. And and while you can kind of deal with a hegemon, a bad hegemon, a hegemon falling apart, or whatever disorder uh, in politics, it's really impossible to revert certain biological limits once they have materialized fully. And so I think that itself pushes, it's a kind of pressure we never had and which we have ignored quite successfully, but which cannot be much longer ignored. And I think when I think of places like the Middle East and even China and a lot of the islands, unfortunately,
Mhm.
uh, you one country might conquer part of the Middle East, but nobody will be able to live there in 60 years from now. China might become the global hegemon, but they will be the first one of the first few countries with India to have what's called the wet bulb temperature, which is deadly within 24 hours. Your body cannot sweat because of certain temperature and pressure humidity condition that is triggered by climate change and which is likely to occur and which almost has occurred once in
Yeah.
Iran, I think. It was very close, 50 something. You need a particular configuration of data, but
Mhm.
that kind of tells me that China will have to move on that ahead of other bigger states that maybe like in the West might think that they can just create a huge fortress for themselves and
Right.
secure enough supply chains and continue that way and send the World Bank to send loans to the countries that face these problems. uh, uh,
Yeah.
so yeah, so I wonder how that is going to change the picture because it brings it. We've never had that dynamic,
Right.
and while at the moment it's maybe still an imaginary thing, um, I feel that it forces us to really think in long term in the future, or at least medium term, which
Yeah.
is a habit maybe we haven't had so far. It
Well,
definitely doesn't look like the United States is thinking more than 2 days in the future at the moment. Yeah.
but here's the thing. China has had the ability to think 50 years at a time. Sometimes many of their policies are not even for the next 10, 15 years because they're thinking 50 years at a time. And I think one of the advantages of living with that kind, and this is where it puts some real interesting pressures on countries that want to pursue a democracy similar to the United States or a lack of democracy similar to China, because they see China being able to plan ahead for 50 years, whereas the United States just can't plan even the next couple of hours. I mean, it's just crazy. They have the inability to plan at all in the United States now. That changes the way you look at things. China has much better understanding of the climate change issue. I see what's happening right now in China. They're already making alternatives to oil and gas. Not that they want to completely dismiss the possibility of oil and gas, but they're using several different alternatives to short their energy package, if you will. It's a country that doesn't have a lot of natural resources itself, so it has to depend on resources coming from somewhere else. Uh, Hence, the Belt and Road Initiative is one way to accomplish this. Dealing with countries as partners, as opposed to dealing with them as subservience, is another way of dealing with this. Um, I know that, yes, there are human rights issues in China, in northern part of China. There are human rights issues, and there may be a sense of authoritarianism and a lack of democracy in the Western style of democracy sense. But it does have a unique capability of governance that a lot of people tend to admire right now. Or look at Singapore and the way that Singapore governs. Again, long term, it's not limited to any political party, being in power. I mean, it's much more long term. It's much more inclusive of the populations and so on. You don't see a lot of attempts made to go to war. Which China doesn't waste its money on going to war. Just think about the amount of money that the United States spent on the war in Iran. In Iran, uh, billions of dollars a day. I mean, it's just crazy what they're doing.
It was
Uh,
it was around 2 trillions per war, if I
yeah,
remember correctly. And when you put the trillions together, it's pretty much what China saved during that whole time.
exactly. Yeah. So I mean, which government system do we want to adhere to? And then you put it that kind of either or. I mean, obviously, I think the Chinese are going to win out when it comes to their approach to democracy. Now, however, um, I think you're right. Not everybody likes the Chinese model. Not everyone is drawn to
I,
China's.
I am not drawn yet.
Yes,
There is a
exactly,
lot more that I need to see, having come from a
exactly.
communist culture, and I think I feel at home in in the culture because the communist element is very much the same.
Yeah.
So as much as I feel at home and as much as I admire certain developments they have done, like on green energy and tech and the way they've managed to plan, it's not enough that you are planning long term. You also have to plan well and implement well. And there is a lot of loss, there is a lot of corruption, but in the end, it moves forward.
Right.
which you couldn't say about other communist countries from the past that
True.
died planning, basically. So,
Right.
yeah, that there is a fine balance between planning and a sort of democracy.
Mm,
Not democracy in the Western sense, but there's still a sort of democracy. The moment that link breaks,
mm,
the planning is just a mirage. Like everybody reports the wrong things and nobody knows what's going on over time, and you don't control the system.
right.
So there is, I assume something, some kind of democracy is in play. Not the one that we kind of mean, but there has to be something that keeps everything real enough to continue functioning and kind of deliver. That's not to say China doesn't have huge challenges with the economy as well, and all sorts of things. And I think also the US is going to hit them hard
Mm.
when they can, if they
Yeah.
can. There is a question of if they can, but if they can, they would. And then there's also the AI revolution, which we never know if it's going to deliver as much as it promises, but if it delivers some of that, and if somebody has uh, first mover advantage, which is what they're competing about,
Mhm.
you don't know what that can do to the rules of the game. And you never know. I always think reality is contingent, so I
Right.
don't really know what will happen to the United States. I mean, I don't, at this point in time, it's hard to be that hopeful. Uh,
Mm,
but by not being hopeful, I mean, if the United States embraces some kind of isolationism and goes only in that hemisphere with North America and South America and asserts itself there,
mhm,
and still remains the main economic power, but not the first economic power,
mhm,
will that really be the worst of worlds for American people? Like it's bad, but and for the people in charge, it's completely unacceptable. I think the idea that you're not in charge means somebody else can impose themselves on you, and that is, I think, that must be a trend of thought in Western civilization.
yeah, and I
Yeah.
think you're right about that. I mean, everything's contingent, right, on what happens. Like, for example, we don't know whether or not Trump will be president in 2 years. In that, in a real sense. I mean, in other words, he could be a lame duck president, but for the rest of his term, because the Democrats could take over the House and the Senate.
Mm,
If there's no corruption involved,
mm,
and rigging of the ballots, it looks like the Democrats are going to win both houses. And then that makes him a lame duck president. We've had those situations in the past, right, where we had lame
mm.
duck presidents, and somehow the Americans have been resilient enough to make the kind of transition that's necessary. So I don't rule out the possibility that the United States will not necessarily fall into this authoritarian kind of trap. But I would say that some of the damage that's being done right now to the United States cannot be undone easily.
Mm,
And this is one of the things I fear. Uh, and a lot of it has to do with the way in which the society itself has changed.
mm,
Um, I never thought that Americans would be this unfair, this sort of resistant to immigrants coming in, because they always prided themselves on embracing immigrants because immigrants help to make the country
mm,
thrive. And now we
mm.
have this new set of thinking that immigrants are the problems, right?
But
So if
but
that continues,
can I just throw some
yeah,
comment here? Because this is something I was thinking of saying earlier, which I think is important, and you obviously know about it, but I'm just going to say it for the purpose of having the discussion. I think there one of the reasons we have populism in the West in the
mhm,
manner that we do have it is because of the previous governments, in this
mhm,
case, democratic governments um, in the US, which have created a sort of economy ruled state where you can't tax the rich more, although you need to tax them more because debt is growing, your deficit is expanding, and also you have more needs because the population is aging. So you need to invest more in welfare and all this. You don't want to tax more the rich
Mhm.
because they literally own your treasuries.
Right.
And so they can just vote negatively on the treasuries, which could make the government fall. So you don't have enough space to tax the rich. You can't tax the poor more in the middle classes because they have been stagnant in terms of salaries, or the salaries have been declining for decades.
Yeah.
And so you end up playing this game where you promise you will, but you don't,
Mhm.
and which, in a sense, has forced the United States to do what Trump is doing, because what Trump is doing is really a sort of, if I am very, I mean, I say there's a strategy, but the strategy is, in a sense, pillaging resources from the outside so that you can pay for things without taxing.
Mhm.
So it's it's not very different in a sense from colonization, when you got resources from the outside. And for example, in England, both the Tories and the Whigs were in favor of that because they wanted to use the money for different purposes. For one side it was welfare state, for the other side was something else, investing in businesses or whatever. But so in a way, you don't want to raise the taxes for anyone because you are caught as a state, as a political force, but you have to promise that you will deliver investment without charging and raising taxes on anyone. I'm not saying that's exactly happening. I'm sure the
Oh, in
taxes
fact,
are raised on the poorest.
yeah, that was going to say that. In fact, that is not really happening right now
Yeah.
because the hope was that, as for the Trump administration, they have a very actually they have a very infantile notion of tariffs that doesn't really reflect serious economic thinking. The idea that you can somehow tariff a country uh, in the hope that you can bring in large amounts of revenues into your coffers, it hasn't worked. We know it hasn't worked because the people have benefited from whatever monies that came out of those tariffs. And also, you're dealing with a person, an individual that imposes a 50% tariff on one country today and then reduces it to 10% the next day. I mean, there's no sort of balance, and there's no sort of mental balance in terms of what he does. He goes overboard on one side and then pulls back and becomes what they call the taco president.
It's
Um,
but it's just somebody that coerces you, and once he's got you there, he coerces you again and again and again as the need
yeah,
arises. And sometimes they use the tariffs to extract something else out of you.
exactly. But you
Uh,
see, people are catching on to this. That's the scary part for him. Now, people are catching on to this. I notice it in the way that Canada responds to him now with tariffs. People are catching on to what he's doing, and it doesn't work anymore because they know exactly what he's trying to do. We don't care what level of tariffs he places on Canadian products anymore. Because at the end of the day, there's an agreement between Canada and Mexico and the United States that has to be formalized through the regular system of formalization of rules about trade, and that's still ongoing. That's still going on, regardless of what Trump has done. So um, I don't think that we are as worried about this as was thought. Plus, his own people in the MAGA world, are having difficulties because they're seeing increases in their foods, in the groceries shopping. They're seeing in the price of products in the grocery shops. They're seeing increases in gas. They're seeing a whole bunch of things that doesn't look as though these tariffs are really helping them. So I think that's going to backfire on him as well. So I think
yeah,
when we look at this, we have to think of it in terms of, and I agree with you. I mean, there's always the economic uncertainty of the period, the deindustrialization, the precarity of work.
That's what I
Uh,
want to go back to because that was my argument, and I'll just finish very quickly. So, what I was trying to say is there hasn't been investment in infrastructure for 30 years in the Western countries, and that has to do a lot with the, I think, in my view, not only but the taxation system and also the way the uh, multinational corporations work and the finance sector works and hedge funds and so forth. So I think it's that has pushed things over the edge. And if I am trying to live in and have housing and I don't have housing and the media says that this is because of immigration,
right.
then eventually, if I don't have an analysis of the whole system or what's happening, which is hard to derive and definitely very hard to obtain from media uh, or social media, then the idea that this is caused by immigrants primarily uh, seems to make sense. I mean, if there'll be less people, there'll be more housing, rather
Mhm.
than wondering why haven't we built more housing in 30 years, or why aren't we redeveloping whatever housing we might have, or why aren't we making some of the private land public in the case of England and build housing? Because one of the reasons we can't build houses here is because much of the land is not publicly owned by it's not owned by the state. So there's this dimension where the elites have brought this onto themselves, really,
Mhm.
this populism, and so when we are talking about changing the system, uh, I can understand a little bit where the MAGA voter is coming from, and I also understand those who wonder if a democratic return would actually just return to the way things were, or would be able to address this issue, which is foundational to, in my view, to why populism appeared in this way. Uh,
Mhm.
so because it has to do with whatever the nexus of power is in the United States when that party takes over, and how something that at times looks at the plutocracy operates. And while I feel positive about the options ahead as well, and I love your perspective, I think when people are reacting so in ways that are unjustified
Mhm.
regarding immigration, there is something real at the bottom of it, which
Yeah.
has been caused by their society.
Mhm.
It's
Yeah.
not totally manufactured from from social media. There's a lot of that, and there's a lot of previous prejudices that this plays into,
Mhm.
which is another issue. Yeah.
Yeah, and I'm glad you raised that because I've been doing a lot of work recently on white supremacy in the Canadian Armed Forces, and I just came back from a conference in Calgary where I was speaking to 350 military guys in uniform. And I'm sure that most of them didn't like what I had to say, but I think it was important to say it. And that is that there's an element of xenoracism that's present, that's structurally present within Canada, the United States, many European countries as well. And so, and I think there is a reason for that because, as you say, um, uh, you know, people are watching to see the immigration and demographic changes that are happening in their own countries. There are debates about multiculturalism now that weren't there a couple of years back. There's a perceived erosion of national identity, for example. There's a sense of, well, we have to take things back, right? This populism kind of thing mobilizes societies to construct a moral boundary to keep people out that shouldn't be here. And so it's the people versus the outsider, the immigrants, the minority groups, and the cosmopolitan elites. So this is where I think the work that I've been doing recently on xenoracism really comes to play,
Mm.
um, because it demonstrates that in this interregnum period that we're living in, those kinds of cultural and identity anxieties gets exacerbated.
Mm.
In when there is destabilization or when there is fickleness in the economy or whatever, those things get exacerbated during this period, which makes it even more important to actually think beyond the interregnum, because the interregnum is that all those things are happening. We have to think about what happens after. the interregnum, what kind of order we would put in place. And this is where the network kind of order that we were talking about, the multi-level kind of governance, the intermestic nature of the governance, all those kind of things are very important. And of course, subsidiarity, right? Give people power at the bottom so they can make decisions for themselves. I think that that can have is not the answer for everything, but it actually would help to get rid of some of the ambiguity that comes with the rise of populism over things like national democratic processes, right? So security and fear, these are two big things in politics, right? We have to look at migration surges, and we have to look at the war that's going on in Ukraine, the war in Iran, the economic shocks that are happening because of shutting down of the Strait of Hormuz. All these things are part and parcel of the security fears in politics, but there are also the populism elements, right? The thing that lead to populism. You know, we are giving people a sense of who the enemy is as political leaders, right? We're saying the enemy happens to be the immigrant, the guy next door who is a different color than you are, speaks a different language, doesn't hasn't sort of integrated within the society as much as they should have. Those kind of things, but I think those things are very simplistic solutions to the problem, and that's why I think we have to be very careful not to embrace populism as the answer, because populism really is a simplistic notion to deal with the problem is much more complex. The world is much more complex, interdependent, to use Robert Cohen, Joseph Nye's term. And that means that it's not just interdependent, right? There's a complexity to the interdependence that make it almost difficult or impossible to govern using the same old traditional forms of governance. So we have to think more creatively. We have to be a little bit more open to accepting a different ideology, if you will, if you want to use that term. We have to be a little bit more discerning when it comes to the approach that we use. I like the fact that you mentioned about the longer term view, right? The 50 years of planning that the Chinese do, compared to say the United States, one day at a time, 1 hour at a time. So there is that notion that we need to really think differently about governance, think differently about the ideas that underpin the governance institutions, and also be very observant of where countries are in that hierarchy of states, because that hierarchy may not necessarily be available to us anymore if you move to the network system where there are nodes and there are different sort of levels of multi-governance and so on, multi-level governance. The hierarchy may not matter as much anymore as it did before, and therefore we have to think about a different form of governance. And I don't know if it can be, I don't know if it was clear enough in terms of explaining my position, but you can tell that it's not a black and white position, right? It's very much contingent upon how we move forward as a society. I like the fact that you're raising issues like climate change and what that can do to force us to think differently about governance. And we can say the same thing about pandemics. We went through this pandemic that really changed the way in which we thought about governance as well. And then there's a whole technology revolution that's happening, and it happens. We've had technology revolutions before. Before the typewriter. We had a cable. We had a whole bunch of different kind of technological transformations that have made things hopefully better for society. So we shouldn't ignore the technological changes that are on the way. And I realize that maybe the governance mechanisms that we use today may change because of those technological changes in the future. So I think that's where I would end it for myself in terms of where we go from here.
I think this is beautiful, and I just have a comment and one final question, and I think
Yeah.
that's it if you have time. So I think there were some in Europe who thought that what was clearly very kind of racist discourse and politics, form of politics, was maybe uh, just used to gain political status, basically.
Mm.
And it was only when Vance and others came over and they gave the speeches, and
Mhm.
Trump himself gave the speeches about civilization. And it doesn't take long to realize that that civilization they keep mentioning that we should defend is a white supremacy type of civilization
And not only that,
that
Christian
yeah
national.
yeah that most Europeans start to think, wait, if that is a pillar of foreign policy, then you actually can say that there is white supremacy. It's not just as debatable as it might have been before from a European perspective. So that's one thing I wanted to mention, and I want to link that with the 400 years of world order led world orders led by European nations, which have all pretty much been founded on this principle.
Right.
And in that context, to ask what are your thoughts about the continent of Africa and the African Union and the way they are positioned right now between what might be two blocks, US and China, at least for a while. If there's anything you want to share, maybe for encouragement for people who are from that region of the world that might be listening. Yeah.
Yeah. Well, that's a very good question, and it sort of relates to a lot of the stuff I've been doing just recently on Pan-Africanism.
Mm,
But Pan-Africanism is a, a concept as good as any sort of European concept. We always think in terms of the Europeans as being the European philosophers and their contributions to knowledge and so on. Our universities happen to be very Eurocentric in that sense, right? So we're trying to change, not necessarily throw the baby in the bathwater altogether, because that's not good either. But we want to be able to embrace other ideologies, other epistemologies, other ontologies, other methodologies, right? That may not be from Europe. And in fact, Europe may actually be dependent upon a lot of things that came out of Africa that we don't give enough credit to. So there's that African way of thinking, the Pan-Africanist approach now, which is really global in a lot of ways, because Africans are found all over the place, thanks to slavery. The Europeans were responsible for that too. But in large part, I think what we have now is a continent that's just on the verge of emerging. There's so much evidence about on this right now. I spent a little time with the Commonwealth looking at the Nigerian election, the last presidential elections. I spent some time in Nigeria and watching and sort of observing what was happening there. I can tell you uh, that country is about to boom because of the large number of young people that are in the country right now. The presence of young people. This is going to be a problem for Europeans. This is going to be a problem for Canada. This is going to be a problem for some other countries where the population is aging so rapidly and not being replenished by young people. So and then you don't want to have immigrants either. So you sort of get rid of immigrants. You get rid of everybody's on sort of limited children per family, that sort of stuff. But the thing is, the Africans are booming when it comes to young people. They're smart. They're much smarter than most people want to give them credit for, but they're very smart. I've known several of them that have gone on to Rhodes scholarships. I then have to debate with their family members about whether or not they're going to take the Rhodes scholarship because they're very smart. But at the same time, Rhodes has a certain a certain character that they don't really want to subscribe to, but they take it anyway, and then they use it against Rhodes. I mean, they're very smart people. So I think what we're looking at is a continent um, which has a lot of potential for conflicts, yes, a lot of potential for animosity and ideological differences and so on. Most of it created by the Europeans, by the way. So if they can overcome that, I can see this whole big continent of Africa thriving. Furthermore, what's happening now is a very big emphasis on South-South trade, South-South relationships. So, for example, the Bridgetown Initiative, which is in my country where I was born, Barbados. Mia Mottley, the Prime Minister of Barbados, is probably one of the most popular prime ministers that we've ever seen. She's won 3 elections in a row by winning every single seat each time. Nobody's ever done that. 3 elections in a row, winning every single seat each time. There's no opposition. So she has to create her own opposition. that's how that's how that's how that's how it is. But she governs well, so that's why people keep electing her to office. She is now being thought of as a possible Secretary General to the United Nations, right? Because people are thinking that she has this ability to capture the imagination of people, especially in the third world, in the developing world. She has created these links to Ghana and to Kenya and to South Africa and to where else? Um, Namibia, different places, because she has this ability to say, we are all in this together, you know, and let's try to see if we can overcome things by working together. And don't be so dependent upon the North because we haven't done very well with that dependency anyway. Don't be so dependent upon the United States because, you know, the United States is kind of a bellwether kind of country when it comes to the Caribbean. There's sometimes they're in it because they want to deal with Venezuela or Cuba, but on other issues they don't care that much about Caribbean countries. So I mean, she's pivoting towards China because China is giving better deals when it comes to infrastructure and you know no conditions on loans in the way that IMF and the World Bank might do. So I think that she is demonstrating that there's a kind of leadership among the minority groups of the world, which is the vast majority of the world now. Um, but but there are people like her that have this ability to think ahead and to plan ahead. And if African leaders can actually produce more leaders like that, I can see them doing very, very well in the future. So, you know, this American century that we are now coming out of is no longer going to be an American century in that century. You know, it's going to be in the East or in Africa, combination of Africa and China. That's a powerful combination right there. And then India and Pakistan, you know, they are also growing. They're also moving ahead as well. And then places like Brazil, the Latin American countries have to be taken seriously in consideration in terms of how they want to see the next world order look like. So they have to take them into consideration as well. So I have a lot of hope because I think it's not just about color or skin color. It's about it's about people who have been marginalized and be resilient enough to overcome that marginalization and still do relatively well, given the fact that they went through this 400 years of being subdominant to Britain and to the European countries. Now they're sort of getting out of their shell and they're sort of growing. So I would want to make sure that we pay attention to those places and not just focus on the north-south trade or trying to sort of piggyback on middle powers to do well. They can also do well on their own, and that's why this active non-alignment thing. I'm really, really hoping that you read that one because that book because I'm struggling now to go through it,
I
but I
would.
want to. I think there's something there that will appeal to the countries of the South, the global South. Yeah.
Thank you. I think
Thank you
that's
very much.
all the questions I had available.
Well,
Thank.
I sort of exhaust you with my long answers, but
No, I absolutely enjoyed this session, and I have been waiting for it for about 20 years. So I,
20 years.
yeah, 20 years. It's been around 2001 or 2 that I heard about you, and I was hoping
Well,
to.
this is very interesting. At a conference in Calgary, you know, it was you just have to just imagine being thrown into the den of lions, right? Because
Mm.
basically that's what it was, right? Me, the only civilian on the podium, And then they'll have all these military guys dressed in their uniforms because they always dress in their uniforms. And it was really a conference about land power. So the military, the army, right, of the Canadian Armed Forces. And here am I talking about to them about their problem, the xenoracism and white supremacy in the military. So it's not one of the things that you will you would want to mention in a room like that. But I had the temerity to do it. I did it because I think it's very important to grapple with that issue. If they don't deal with it, it's going to fester and it's going to become such a big problem for Canada, right? So I've been pushing that. But I got two guys came up to me. One guy came up to me and says, at the end, he says, "Thank you very much for that presentation." He says, you know, some of my seniors may not like it, but I certainly like it because I've seen with my own eyes individuals who've been marginalized because of their race, um, indigenous people who've been marginalized because of their practices, women who've been mistreated and sexually assaulted and stuff like this, all in the military. And this is the military that's supposed to be trusted to serve Canadians, and yet still they're not having the values that Canadians claim to espouse. You know, we had a unit that was completely, disintegrated because in Somalia, then they had the so-called Somalia affair, where the Canadian person killed a Somali youth on a peacekeeping mission. So, you know, we've had that kind of black eye within the military as well. And it was all racist, or, you know, it was a racist kind of killing. So he said, look, all these things are happening. And I know I've seen it myself. And I've been around people who are comfortable enough with me to tell me things like, I joined the military to learn how to kill brown and black people. I mean, this is like, say, openly, right? And then he says to me, you may not remember me, but 25 years ago, I sat in your global security class at the University of Alberta. So I taught him 25 years ago. I completely forgot who he was, you know, but he remembered and he was in my classes. And then another guy came to me afterwards and said, 30 years ago, you taught me at Bishop's University in Quebec. And then he told me about my kids, and he said, well, that makes sense because my kids are now 30. So, I mean, obviously that's been a long time, but I did teach there, and I couldn't even remember who he was because it was like, you know, how do you remember like 30 years ago, kids that came out in and out of your class? Um, but he also had very positive things to say. So I know there's a generation of people who have actually witnessed the xenoracism and the white supremacy thing that permeates within the military. And I knew there was going to be pushback. So one of the things I did, and before I gave my speech, I asked everybody to look up, turn around, look around you in this room, and tell me what you see. Over 90%, easily over 90%, white males. So military hasn't changed from in terms of its composition of people in the military in Canada. Even up to this point, there's still 90% white males, very few indigenous peoples. There's only one other indigenous person at that conference with me, and he was on the podium with me on the same panel. So, you know, it spoke for itself. I didn't have to say very much more than that. And then in my speech, then of course, you know, I hit them pretty hard in terms of their inability to change. And I said it's not just individual cases of racism anymore. It's structurally embedded racism. That's why it's not easy to change. And somebody has to say it. And then the leadership has to be responsible for helping to undo that. So it was that's where I am right now in terms of the kind of research I'm doing now. It's less about global governance now and more about some what I consider to be intermestic issues, right? Because this is a global problem as well as a domestic problem, and people are being radicalized into extremists while they're in the military, and that's a very dangerous combination because they learn how to kill. That's their job, right? To learn how to kill, and if you do decide that you want to kill people who are not like you, that's where the black and brown people comes in, right? The indigenous people, the women, LGBTQ people, you know, the list goes on and on. Anybody that's marginalized would be in that category. So I spend a lot of time now on marginalization and how do we sort of form um, camaraderie among the marginalized in order to be able to overcome that stigma of marginalization. So I hope that helps.
Thank you for saying that. That just shows something else that the entire interview has shown, which is that it takes a lot of courage in this day for researchers to tackle these topics and speak about them publicly. It's very hard at the moment, I think, to tackle a lot of issues. And
Yeah.
there's a lot of researchers that understand a lot of these issues, but not many that are willing to speak about it. And I also have to thank you because I have seen you present before, and you are able to speak in very abstract terms, and you've kind of took the language down to my level and everyone's level, so we can all understand what you are telling us.
You know,
Others might not know this, but like you have put some effort in in bringing the conversation
when you
to,
read my
to our
stuff,
level. Yeah.
you know this because when you read my stuff, you can tell it's sometimes a little bit esoteric and abstract, theoretical and that sort of stuff. But I think I always like to think of being an academic as being more than just simply a person that talks to people in the classroom.
Mm.
You can do you do a very good job of doing that in the classroom, right? And talking about the theories of international relations and that sort of stuff. But when the rubber hits the road is when the academics are able to translate what they're saying academically to the public. So public intellectualism, I think, is very important for me, and I try my best to do that. So I get calls, sometimes it backfires on me a little bit because then I get lots of calls for interviews and stuff because I can break it down to a level that everybody can understand. At least I hope so. And then I get called up to give these interviews. So it's a good thing. But it puts a lot of burden, like you say, and a lot of strain on people, especially if you're a person of color working in an ostensibly white university where the structure of racism is present in the university as well. So all these institutions like the military, the police force, the intelligence agencies, the universities, the colleges, I mean, they're all literally have embedded structures of racism. And they don't want to admit to it because especially in Canada, because you're very good about sweeping things under the rug. But somebody's got to say something about it. And I ended up having to be one of those people that found myself in the position with tenure and being able not to be fired for what I say, to be able to say things that other people would not say. So I see that as a very important responsibility, and I don't mind being the target because I think I can hold my own on the platforms of anybody who has thought through these problems because sometimes they haven't thought through it sufficiently, and I just say exactly what I think. And the worst part about this for me is for other people is that if you're a young person not yet tenured, you can be cowed into not saying anything. I mean, it's very easy. Why would you put yourself on a limb? When you are not the problem, why would you just saddle yourself with this trying to sort of correct the problem that you did not create, right? Because I hear a lot of them talk to me this way, and I keep telling them, sometimes spaces are open and you just have to fill the space because if you don't fill it, somebody else will fill it that will not be as tolerant as you are, that will not have the empathy that you have. So you better fill the space, and that's been my whole attribute all along in academia. So and then again, I can feel the sense and the presence of a Baha'i kind of support for some of the things I say. I don't always necessarily quote Baha'i readings, but I can tell you it's generated from having a knowledge, at least of Baha'i faith, and I think that there is a hope, that if you get any hope in the future, like it's based on that religious belief, right? So there's hope. There's hope. I like to keep people hopeful, despite the fact that what I have to say many times but quite negative. But I have to give them that extra hope that things are going to change for the better.
I think you are doing it very well and through serious concepts.
Yeah.
It's not just an attitude.
Yeah.
It's really a research perspective, a
Mhm.
rich research perspective. Thank you so much. I think we can end here.
Great.